Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here with the next chapter of A London Book Window by James Milne, and today's chapter is titled A Librarian's Anecdotage. We often ask ourselves when we are young and have illusions, who would I like to be if I were not myself? It is a lovely question because it lets us dally with things of the imagination at the time that the imagination is budding. It is a futile question because if you were somebody else, you would be quite different, and so you would just begin the inquiry all over again. There is, however, another question which is more practicable. What would I be if I were not what I am? It is more practicable because though we cannot change our personalities and identities, we can, and many people do, change our vocations. Perhaps as one grows older, it is hardly worthwhile putting even that question. But in a healthy mind, illusions are always trying to rout delusions. Myself, I often put it in a particular form, because when I look around and see businessmen so successful and so rich, I say, oh, to be a businessman. Applying that to myself, I add, what businessman would I like most to be? My considered answer is that I would like to be a librarian, because it is, if one may so describe it, business on one side and literary on the other. Thus I should not be taken away from my reading and writing, a robbery of these things being a disaster which is inconceivable. Probably I first thought like this years and years ago, when I knew Mr. William Foe, who then presided over the circulating library of Messrs. W. H. Smith and Son, a house eminent in the business of newspapers and books. It is natural to be thinking of him, for he was one of the most true-born and gifted librarians that ever championed the fortunes of literature. He served, if I remember rightly, fully half a century under the flag of Smith, which to him was an emblem as dear as the heart of the Douglas was to his warrior followers. Necessarily in that time, Old Foe, as he was lovingly called, had many adventures with books and authors, and he told me some of them, and now I am going to recall them for your benefit, more or less in his own words. A little incident, of which he was pardonably proud, had to do with the first story published by Thomas Hardy. Our Smith's librarian and William Tinsley, the publisher, met one day at the Old Gaiety Bar, a famous meeting place when London was Victorian. A manuscript was sticking out of Tinsley's pocket, and Mr. Foe asked who had written it. Tinsley answered that he thought it was by a newcomer, but he had not had time to read it. Give it to me, said Mr. Foe, and I will take it home and read it for you. He was attracted by the story, thought it clearly bespoke a great writer, and sent Tinsley the advice that he ought to publish it quickly. The novel fell flat until one of the weeklies gave it a belated review, when it jumped into circulation, and that was how, in 1871, Desperate Remedies began its career and also began Thomas Hardy as an English novelist. Another time, a member of the House of Macmillan, calling on Mr. Foe, said a word in direct recommendation of John Inglesant, which was just coming out. Always anxious to hear of a good story, especially one well written and full of thought, Mr. Foe said he would read it and see what he thought of it. He did so, found it, in his judgment, to be a fine novel, and did everything he could to make it the success which it became. Perhaps one may add that the career of this study of the Oxford movement was greatly helped by the interest which Gladstone showed in it. When Mr. Foe chatted about his library work, he was always careful to say that he did not do so in any spirit of vanity, but as showing what gleams of color, what grateful little incidents might come into a circulating library. He was an early admirer of Stevenson, and recollected having bought cheap remainders of In the Cevennes and of An Inland Voyage. They kept very well until Stevenson's Triumph arrived, when they became worth more than their published prices, and if one could get them today, they would be worth a lot more than their original prices. One finds that bookmen, though they are not always inclined to adventure stories, all love Stevenson's Treasure Island, probably because it is so very well written, so artistic in its composition, so finished in every detail. Mr. Foe liked it when he read it, before it was published in book form, and he ordered it largely for his library. Accordingly, he had something of a sense of personal pride when it won fame for Robert Louis Stevenson. Again and again, I would ask Mr. Foe, what is it that causes a book to be read? What gives it a start? and every time he answered very much in the same terms. He insisted that a book, whether a novel or some other kind of work, must be worthy before it could achieve any lasting success. No book that had not quality, originality, personality, or something to distinguish it and mark it out from the run of books could do greatly. An author might log roll it, a publisher might advertise it, anything might be done with it, but the public was not to be tempted unless there was a human savor in what was being offered. After that, we came to another matter, namely, given originality, talent, or even, if you like, genius in a book, what was the subtle agency that brought it and the readers together in a sympathetic way, which means success for it and pleasure for them? Mr. Foe held, although he admitted the difficulty of answering such a question, that the greatest invitation to the reading of a new book was dinner table talk. No doubt such talk was largely based on what people saw in the newspapers about new books. But the telling element was the personal recommendation. Somebody read a newspaper review and learned that here was a particular book worth getting. Most likely, however, that somebody did not get it until a friend was met at the dinner table who said, "I have just finished that book, and it is splendid. Order it at once from the library." Advice like that was acted upon, because it came directly, because it was individual. There was a day when John Murray III said to Mr. Foe that if a Murray book got a good review in the Times, he was sure of selling the edition. Probably no single review anywhere would have an effect like that nowadays, when readers are so much more numerous, so much more democratic, and so much more scattered in their newspaper reading. Mr. Foe was sure, however, that when he heard a book, the subject of keen dinner table conversation, it was going to be largely read. "I have been reading such and such a book," somebody would begin. "What sort of book is it?" somebody else would ask. And so its popularity would roll along, gathering speed as it rolled. I think that's sort of how BookTube works, isn't it? We talk about a book, and it gathers steam and speed, and it becomes popular. BookTube is sort of our new dinner table talk. It was a pity Mr. Foe did not write his reminiscences as a librarian, because he had some amusing experiences, which he could have told apart from such general anecdotage as I have been recalling. As library subscribers do not write letters unless they have a complaint to make, he was not, like a poor newspaper editor, dolged with correspondence. He once, however, got a letter from the writer of a book, saying he would like Smith's People to circulate it, but that apparently it was not on their list. This author was told that a record had been made of the book and that it would be got by the library if anybody wanted it. To this came the offer, would Smith accept a copy, and a copy was duly accepted. Well, some months later, our obliging and pleasant author wrote saying he had been in 6 different parts of the country, and that at each place he had always been able to get his book from Smith's. He was entirely happy with himself and with Smith's. Dear fellow, he had to be informed in acceptable language that the volume he had got every time was the very one which he himself had presented, and that it had only been out on those 6 occasions. That's kind of funny. So that's an author going around to different circulating libraries, which I assume are all connected, requesting his book just to see if they've got it, and thinking there are 6 different copies in circulation. But apparently interlibrary loans, as we will call it nowadays, and he is just getting the copy that he donated. And apparently he's the only one to have taken it out. That's quite disappointing. Moving on. There was a touch of pathos in this little story, nor is it wanting in another which Mr. Foe had in his treasury. An author joined the library, paying 12 shillings, so as to be able to order a book written by himself, which it cost 18 shillings to buy. Nobody else wanted it, but that did not upset him. The censor of the Strand, as Mr. Foe was sometimes called, quite unnecessarily, because he was the most broad-minded and gentle man in the world. He merely said that Smiths lost 6 shillings on their deal with that particular author, but that the human nature in it was worth the banging of the 12 sixpence. If we knew everything, we should probably know that authors do occasionally write to the circulating libraries, saying they have difficulty in getting particular books, without mentioning that these are books by themselves. Mr. Foe had many little epistles like that, and he would reply to them nicely, much preferring them to the more roundabout action of other authors, who remained silent themselves, so he said, but stirred up their friends to ask early and often for their new book. Nobody knew more about the old-fashioned English 3-volume novel than our friend, for he saw it reach its heyday of prosperity, and he assisted it to an end. He thought it often permitted a writer who otherwise would not have a chance to make a beginning in authorship, because there was not much risk in publishing it at the price of $1.50. He combated the idea, however, that the 3-volumer was in any way an integral part of the circulating library, that the one could not exist without the other. It might in some measure have been a library invention, but he fancied that it belonged to the end of the 18th century, when Walter Scott was becoming famous. Speaking of the appearance of some 3-volume novels which had made their mark, he recalled Benjamin Disraeli's Lothair. That was his first great book as a politician, or, if one likes to turn the phrase about, his first book as a great politician. It was wonderfully read, far more widely read than Disraeli's Endymion, which at first made infinite stir, and then declined rapidly. When the librarians afterwards sold out their copies of this novel, for which, at trade prices, they had paid more than 21 shillings, they only got half a crown for them. Well, one wonders if anybody would give even that today for any 3-volume novel, if only because it takes so much space in a private library. When William Foe reigned over Smith's library, English women had become by far the greatest readers of English novels, and he attributed many of the booms to them. Today, women are still greater majority of our novel readers, and it may even be that a larger percentage of all the books read are novels, though that is hard to conceive. Once, by taking a little census of the books which went out on circulation from Smith's, Mr. Foe was able to establish that 80% were fiction. He fancied that this might be something like an average figure for libraries throughout England, certainly in the south of England. But he would point out that as one goes farther north in these islands, people read more serious literature. He did not know why this should be, but perhaps he was right in suggesting that the more vital climate of the north stimulates a mind to more serious exercise. That's kind of a funny perspective. People read more seriously where it's cold? I don't know if that's true. And it's interesting, too, that he's grouping fiction as sort of a separate genre and then talking about serious literature as something else, as if fiction or novels can't be serious literature. And I suppose serious literature in this day would be things, like philosophy, the Greek and the Latin classics. So it certainly is a different perspective from how we view genres today. What was the best advice that Mr. Foe could give to an author wishful to write good books, but at the same time books which would sell and so enable him to keep writing? His answer, after he had thought over the question for a little in his grave way, was this: give the very best in yourself to your book, and then put it into the hands of a publisher who will handle it well and especially advertise it well. He added that there must be imagination in a writer if he was to lay hold of his reader, who otherwise would turn from a book calling it dry. So the supreme thing in a book is that it shall have the vague something, which is personality, for whether you call it talent or genius, it is the gift of the literary gods. And so that's an interesting way to end there. Just sort of summing it up, that books are popular because they have that certain something that Milne is unable to pinpoint, and that I think most people today are still unable to pinpoint. A book becomes popular when you have this perfect storm of, advertising and also word of mouth, but also, the book itself has something or other that appeals to the reader. So that is the end of that chapter. Next week's chapter is titled Epistles of Married Love.